Welcome to the Solar Builder Buzz. I am Chris Kroll, editor-in-chief of Solar Builder magazine. As we're watching the federal tax credits be ripped away from residential solar, I thought it was a good time to catch up on net metering changes happening across the country. Kind of the other things that have started to be ripped away from residential solar to kind of take stock of where that is today. And a great resource for doing this is the NC Clean Energy Technology Center. The center is home to the database of states' incentives for renewables and efficiency, DSIRE, a public good that provides information on policies and programs related to clean energy at the federal, state, local, and utility level across the U.S. And its 50 States of Solar report is invaluable. It provides insights on state regulatory and legislative discussions and actions on distributed solar policy, with focus on net metering, distributed solar valuation, interconnection rules, all sorts of stuff. And so joining me today to discuss the report is Rebecca De La Mora, Senior Policy Analyst at the NC Clean Energy Technology Center at NC State University. Hey, Rebecca.
Hi, Chris. Good to be here.
Yeah, thank you for taking the time today. And looking at the report, the Q1 report for 2025 published in April, what are some top-line trends in the changes being made to traditional rate design features and net metering policies?
Yeah, so we do our report every 3 months at the end of each quarter. So our most recent report, like you said, in April covered the Q1, January, February, March of 2025. And so over the past few years, over the past quarters, a lot of the trends you've been seeing have been really focused on, for residential solar customers, a shift to time-varying rates, a shift to successor tariffs, changing the credit value, integrating multifamily units, and then also a little bit of fees. So I'm going to go through those one by one. So first, we have the time-varying rates, also called time of use rates. And this also kind of ties in a little bit with the successor tariffs of, in traditional net metering, usually you pay the utility for whatever electricity you use, and in return, they pay you for whatever energy you export to the grid, usually at the retail rate. So you're getting paid the same amount that you pay. And it's usually on a monthly basis. So the entire billing period, you just one-to-one value it out. You either, sold more to utility or you got more from utility. And that is going to be what your bill looks like. With the shift, however, to successor tariffs and time of use rates, we're kind of seeing a change in how that compensation is being kind of graded during the day. And so because when you actually look at how the grid functions, the demand and the capacity of the grid is going to change throughout the day. Higher, when people get home, lower in the middle of the night or when people are at work. And so that doesn't actually always line up exactly with when you're actually generating solar energy and exporting it to the grid. And so states and utilities are looking to kind of shift. So you're getting more of that real time or closer to real time value out of this distributed solar energy. So along with that, we're also then seeing changes to the credit values in and of themselves. Again, traditionally it is based on the retail rate, but as states and utilities are shifting towards those successor tariffs, we're seeing changes where it can be lower than the retail rate. The lowest we'll ever see is usually the avoided cost rate. Then we have the multifamily units. And so traditionally, lots of times, people who live in apartment buildings like myself, we can't actually put solar on a roof because we don't have a roof. So it's usually, if we're going to have on-site solar, it's through the owner of the building. But there are complications to that. When it came to actually compensating them, lots of times they were then treated as a commercial building for the purpose of net metering.
Right.
So we're seeing a lot more states actually shifting that now. So these customers can be treated actually as residential customers and get the same benefits as a residential customer in a single family home. Okay,
that's a positive, I think. Yeah.
Okay. And it's also going to be super important, especially now. I can't mention residential solar without solar for all. So with solar for all coming on, and it is still coming, thankfully, we're going to seeing a lot more interest, particularly for low income and moderate income customers in multifamily or multi-unit homes. And so making sure that they are able to get those same residential benefits as other single family residential customers is really, really important. And then finally, I think the last thing we had was fees. Fees, they're trending still, but they're not as common anymore. Utilities are trying to find alternative ways to kind of compensate for the cost shift, and we can get into that later. The cost shift of how residential solar is impacting how a utility can generate revenue. We're seeing a lot more bigger focus now on utilities changing that netting interval and the credit rate.
Very good. Thanks for that oversight. Definitely a lot I want to dig into. Still looking at the most recent report, 193 policy actions cataloged in Q1. Most common related to compensation rules with 55, 35 with community solar, residential fixed charge and minimum bill increases were 34 of those. And just as saying those numbers, I was just wondering broadly how those numbers compare to other quarters. Are there typically this many actions in these different categories? Is it something trending up or down?
We do track all of these numbers quarter by quarter. In our annual report, we actually include a graph showing the year by year trends for the number of actions. And so on a quarter by quarter basis, it tends to be pretty even. Only exception is oftentimes in the first half of the year in Q1 and Q2, we see a lot more action just because legislators are in session at the state level. Whereas on the regulatory side, it does tend to stay pretty even throughout the year.
Okay, got it.
But when we're looking at like the year by year trend, so when we look at DG compensation, and that's our fancy term of saying net metering, because not everything is technically net metering anymore, so we can't call it that. We've actually seen a pretty big increase since we started tracking these numbers back in 2015. So in 2015, we had around 40. Now we're at almost 100 actions in 2024. And a lot of that is coming from, again, it's a lot of the shifts to the net metering successor tariffs, the net billing, the changes to the credit rates, and it's all that stuff that we talked about. On DG valuation, so that's looking at how do you actually measure and calculate the value of your solar energy. So these are like the actual value of solar studies. That stayed pretty even throughout the years. Fixed charge increases. So since those are technically based on utility rate cases, it kind of goes up and down depending on when utilities actually file those rate cases. So we've been seeing it went up for a while, then it went back down, it's going back up again. And again, it's because utilities are usually on a cycle of when they have to actually file these cases. Demand and solar charges, it's been going down over the past couple of years. Like I said before, like they're still there. They're just, utilities are looking for alternative ways to kind of recoup that money. Third party ownership has also stayed pretty even with a little waves in it, not as popular to change as it was before. We've kind of hit like a steady point of where everything is legal or illegal. And then finally, the last thing we tracked was utility-led rooftop solar. And so that was really popular a few years ago, but it's not as popular now, to the point where we've had quarters where there's just no action on utility-led rooftop solar. So we actually ended up this past quarter, so this new Q1 2025 report, we replaced that one with two new entries: financial incentives and interconnection, because we've been seeing a lot more action related to those in relation to solar than we have with utility-led solar.
So thank you for that overview. We have been saying for a while, just, in industry circles, net metering's dying, net metering's dead. Definitely California had changed the game with their NEM 3 rules, reflecting what you're talking about, more time of use billing, the interval cycles and all that. And it seems like that is broadly true going across the country now. I mean, maybe you wouldn't use the terms dying or dead, but I guess how would you react to us kind of in the solar industry saying, net metering's going away, it's dying, it's dead?
I mean, if we want to take like the traditional definition of net metering, where it's the monthly billing basis or the monthly netting interval with the retail credit rate and things like that, then we're seeing, yes, a lot of states kind of shift away from that to alternative compensation mechanisms, whether it's like net billing, the shorter credit intervals, not doing it at the retail rate. But as a whole, if you want to use net metering in the conceptualization of just compensating for distributed generation, that is still all here. Like almost every single state does have rules in place for some sort of distributed generation compensation. And so while they might be changing some things with it, it's still technically net metering and it's still there. And of course, again, like you said, like California, other states, we've seen shifts to the alternative compensation mechanisms, like net billing or something like that. But it's still not as widespread when you actually look at the map.
If you're listening to this on podcast, seek out the video version. We'll be showing some of these maps in the video. So, for example, in the report in Q1, you noted Nevada utilities filed for a NEM successor that would involve the 15-minute netting intervals for systems 25 kW or less instead of monthly, and the credit rate of 75% though would stay the same. So just by making that interval change, do we have an idea of how much that could impact average compensation?
Yeah, so I can't give you hard numbers on that because that's not something we do, but I can kind of give the general conceptualization of how this works.
Okay.
Because when we're talking about netting intervals, the reason that states and utilities are implementing this comes back to, again, the actual utility and use of the grid. Because, you have high demand during certain times of the day and lower demand during other times of the day. And like I said before, we want to get into compensating this distributed generation at its real-time value. Like, what is the actual value that this energy can give to the grid at this moment in time? And barring, tying the credit rate to the actual, wholesale clearing price, which they're not doing, by the way, for residential customers, you have to find alternative ways to kind of get as close to that as possible. And their solution to that is decreasing the netting interval from the full month to the most common we usually see is 15-minute intervals. So within that 15-minute interval, you're going to then individually do the math of how much did you use versus how much did you produce and sell to the utility for each of those 15 minutes throughout the day. And so when you're doing that, it will affect how you're compensated, generally speaking. The goal, of course, eventually is that the point is for the utility to get the most benefit out of these distributed resources by getting them to sell when the utility is having a lower capacity production, which is usually, when the sun goes down at the end of the day, which also happens to be when everyone gets home and makes dinner and does their laundry and turns on the AC.
Right.
And so when they're doing this, eventually, the true goal would be to have people be able to time when they dispatch their distributed generation. But that, of course, would require you to have some kind of storage system attached to it, which not everyone is going to do. Now, when you're on the standard rate, it might not affect you as much, but these netting intervals are really, really important if you're on a time of use rate. Because on the time of use rate, it means your retail rate does actually change throughout the day. Oftentimes, it's higher during the on-peak periods, like when you get home, lower during the off peaks, like in the middle of the night or, in the middle of the day when everyone's at work.
Generally, does it seem like the shift to the 15-minute netting intervals coincides with time of use rates, or do they not necessarily correlate?
They don't necessarily have to. So one of the things also is some states or utilities will require a net metered customer to enroll on a time of use rate. Not all utilities do that. Not all states do that, even though the state might still have the netting intervals in place. So I don't want to say it's like a one-to-one. You have to be on a time of use rate in order to get the netting interval. But I also don't want to say like there is no correlation whatsoever between having a time of use rate and having the smaller netting intervals.
Okay.
But generally speaking, they would tend to have both at the same time. And I would also say there's a higher chance the utility has implemented some form of time of use rate before they implemented net metering successor tariff, just because of the maturity of the proposal, so to speak.
Yeah, gotcha. Okay. So there was a little bit of nuance there, but in my mind, when I heard like the interval rates, I always kind of jumped to time of use rate. They don't necessarily go together, but they kind of do from what you're saying.
Yeah.
In some, like, maybe they're already on time of use, but yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
It makes sense from a utilities perspective to kind of tie those things together. Because again, there's a lot of utilities out there. So
Right.
like, I don't want to say it's all one way or the other, because definitely there's at least one utility doing it in the way I'm saying it's not being done.
Yeah. All these conversations always have the caveat of there's a lot of nuance. You have to, really know what region and what you're talking about. Yeah. So there,
just assume there's an asterisk to all of the sentences that are coming out of my mouth.
That's right. Me too. Always. So thinking about that, the saturated, I still want to think about the trend here. So saturated solar markets like California have started to obviously change their compensation rates, or the rate of compensation with fear of the duck curve. And I don't want to necessarily talk about the duck curve, but when you look at across the country, there are completely nascent solar markets that seem like they're picking up the policy changes that the more saturated solar markets have moved towards. Well, I guess it does that seem like it's happening?
It's definitely something. It's definitely something we've seen before, where states that maybe have a lower penetration of distributed solar are kind of looking towards the future. Because if you know the duck curve is coming and that you're going to have to deal with it eventually, why not just deal with it now before it even happens, and you can avoid the whole mess in the first place? And so we actually have seen some states kind of transition to those net metering successor tariffs or some sort of alternative compensation before the quote unquote true need is needed to avoid the duck curve. So one example that I think is going on right now is West Virginia. West Virginia doesn't have a super large residential solar market, but of its 4 investor-owned utilities, 2 have already shifted to successor tariff, and 2 are currently in the process of proposing one. So I think they proposed it within their current rate case, And so the commission is currently considering to shift these two utilities to net metering successor tariffs.
The downside is, California built a great residential solar industry with their more friendly compensation rates. And now these markets that don't have much solar penetration will still not probably see that. It's like, I feel like you still want to try to be encouraging. This is just me.
Yeah.
My perspective on it. It's like you're worried about a thing that's probably not going to happen now because you've killed the baby in the crib type of thing. You know what I mean? Sorry to. Okay, I can change how I phrase that, but
Well, I think also one of the most important things to think about is we can talk about, friendly versus unfriendly markets and policies, but lots of times what encouraging solar comes down to is the actual retail rate the customer's paying, and frankly, the geography of where they are. When you're looking at standard traditional net metering, which uses the retail rate for the compensating, if your retail rate is high, that means your compensation and bill credit is also high. If your retail rate is low, that means your compensation and credit rate is also low. So that's why you'll see states like California, Hawaii have that really, really high penetration of solar, even if they don't have quote unquote as friendly policies anymore, just because the retail rate is so high, you can still get a really good deal out of installing solar.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas on the other hand, states with like lower compensation rates, or lower retail rates, it doesn't make it as encouraging. And even when you shift to a successor tariff, the lowest possible thing you could be credited at is the avoided cost. And avoided cost is still not one-to-one perfectly proportionally tied, but it's still tied to the retail rate that you're paying, because all of those numbers are based on how much the utility needs to make money and how much their costs are. Mm-hmm. And so if your retail rate is high, there's a chance your avoided cost is also high. So there's still going to be a baseline minimum where it's still a pretty good deal. And then, of course, you get into the geography of it all. Like, for example, Arizona has a pretty low compensation rate. They're slowly transitioning to the true avoided cost rate down from the retail rate. But they're in the top 10 states in the country. And it's just because it's Arizona. They have so much solar. Why wouldn't you do it?
Right. Okay.
Yeah. So even if you don't have, or even like Texas, I'm from Texas. Texas doesn't even have net metering rules statewide. Mm-hmm. It's up to either a retail electric provider to just voluntarily do it, or if you live outside of ERCOT, your utility might offer it. But it doesn't have net metering rules. There's not a lot of incentives the same way that California or like Connecticut or New York has. But again, it's still in the top 10 states because the credit values are really good and there's just a lot of solar.
You had already named a couple of them, but with my framing of like maybe more solar friendly states or solar friendly utilities in terms of how they have structured their compensation or billing, is there any more that you maybe could point out that or stand out apart from the pack?
Like one concrete example is Alaska. And you don't think of Alaska as like a typical solar friendly state, just because, again, geography wise, it doesn't have a lot of solar compared to a lot of other states, but they've got a proceeding going on with the commission. So the state itself has a statewide aggregate cap where net metering can only make up like 1.5% of utilities load or something like that. But under the new proposed rules, it would go from 1.5% to 20%.
Oh, well, okay.
Which is the highest aggregate cap I have ever seen. I think most other states have aggregate caps. It's usually in like the 5 to 10% range. So 20%, especially from 1.5, is a huge jump to allow net metering customers. So it's super interesting to see this in a state that most people don't particularly think of as like a high solar state. So like I said before, Texas doesn't technically have net metering rules statewide, but there were some bills in the legislature. One was just enacted that allows net metering for large load customers. Obviously not residential customers, but the fact that they made rules in and of themselves is pretty great.
So I mostly wanted to focus on kind of the state of play for residential solar across the U.S. But you noted during the conversation some states, and in the report, that some states are expanding size limits for non-residential net metered system to increase participation. So it's kind of why I've been focusing on maybe what's happening is lessening participation in residential solar, possibly. That's my theory. Are C&I customers potentially seeing more payback opportunities or more encouragement via net metering, net billing incentives? Am I getting that right or no?
I think it's important to note that the size of the system or the maximum size of the system doesn't have as strong an impact on a residential customer as it does on like a commercial or other non-residential customer. The physical size of the building doesn't necessarily correlate to how much electricity they use. because there's a big difference between a department store and a grocery store that's the same size, but has to keep all this food frozen and refrigerated. They actually oftentimes then need those bigger systems. So a grocery store is going to need a bigger system than an equally sized department store because they're just using more electricity in the same amount of space. And finally, I think another thing to consider is when you actually look at like where a utility's customers are and where their electricity is going, a majority of that electricity is going to be going to commercial and non-residential customers, even if they have less commercial customers. Because if you take, for example, a utility with 100 residential customers and one industrial customer, there's a good chance that industrial customer uses 10 times more energy than all of the 100 residential customers combined. And so utilities, if they want to offload that capacity and load onto the customer for on-site generation, it makes sense to increase their ability to have on-site generation.
So that building is going to be self-consuming the solar, and it's not going to be as worrisome for the duck curve that we've been talking about, likely because that building was going to be kind of using the solar as it's happening and helping the grid overall by lessening the load of that site on the grid.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to know that commercial customers like that don't necessarily follow the same demand time of day trends as a residential customer does. Because when you look at the duck curve, it does kind of tend to follow, what you think of as like a 9 to 5 office worker who then goes home, and that's when all the demand increases. But oftentimes, if like industrial sites are often running 24/7, a grocery store has to keep that food cold 24/7, and so their demand values don't necessarily line up precisely with the overall demand curve or the duck curve. And then one more thing I did want to mention was about cost shifting. So one thing that utilities, it's really important for utilities and then solar and non-solar customers is how are utilities recouping their money for providing these services? And so when you have solar on your roof, it means you're using utility services less, so to speak, but yet you're using it less, but they still have to have that baseline. Like even if you're using it less, you still need to have that line interconnecting your house to the grid.
Yeah.
And so that's a flat fee. That's a flat amount of money the utility has to recoup. And so if you're paying less on your bill, that means they're going to have to increase everyone's charges, which will then hurt non-solar residential customers. And so that's lots of times where you might see things like those capacity charges, those grid access charges we were talking about, like fees on solar customers to kind of even out that cost shift. On the commercial side, we don't see that as much because a lot of commercial customers pay demand charges. And so those demand charges are another way for a utility to recoup their money without that really extreme cost shift you might see that you would see in solar versus non-solar residential customers. And so it's not as heavy as a lift for a utility to allow these commercial customers to have more on-site generation.
Are there any particular advancements maybe mentioned in this or things on the table that are in this report that on the commercial side you're keeping an eye on or think like, oh, this could be a good market for commercial solar?
Yeah. So with that framing in mind, actually, then I would say a lot of the opportunity is not going to be what we lay out in our solar report, what we actually lay out in our other reports.
Ooh, intrigue to be continued. Next conversation.
So first report I want to bring up is our power decarbonization report. So again, it goes out every 3 months, like the solar report does, and so that mainly focuses on decarbonizing the electric grid. And this year, we just added a new section on large load customer treatment. So because we've seen a lot of the AI stuff, all the new data centers, a lot of utilities now have to reckon with the fact that here's a new customer that uses 10,000 times more energy than any customer you've ever had before. How are we going to deal with that?
Yeah.
And one of the things we've been seeing is either encouragement or mandates for these large load customers to have on-site generation. And so that's becoming more and more popular, is having, data center specific or large load customer specific tariffs. So they're having their own specific rate, requirements from the state at the legislative or the regulatory level for on-site generation for these types of customers, green tariffs specifically for these customers, things like that. Another thing I want to mention is also probably virtual power plants. So like I talked about before is utility-led rooftop solar, aka utility-owned solar on rooftops of residential customers isn't as popular anymore, but we are seeing an increase in interest in utility-owned energy storage. And so that kind of also ties into that virtual power plant and a little bit of like energy as a service, where the utility can then utilize all of these different resources your residential homes storage, the grocery storage system, the data center storage system, and then collate it so it all goes onto the grid aggregated at once. But then in your own spare time, you can use it whenever you want. And so we've been seeing a lot of that. And this is a free thing you can download. With the Smart Electric Power Alliance, we released a report summarizing all of the action on virtual power plants and other aggregated DER programs over the year 2024. So you can download that for free on our website, or I think on the Smart Electric Power Alliance website. So I think that's another opportunity for a lot of these installers to look at, is especially because with a virtual power plant, like, yes, you need storage to dispatch the energy, but you need something to generate the energy in the first place as well. You can't just dispatch something if you're not creating it.
Right. Yeah. So that's a good thing to keep an eye on, definitely, is the utilities that are forward thinking in terms of on-site storage. And it's like, yeah, that makes more sense if they were to say, yeah, we're going to maybe take more ownership over this. If you're installing solar, that's great, that's useful, but we're going to now own a battery system, or you encourage it and then use your battery system for our purposes in a virtual power plant, and then kind of everyone can maybe win then a little bit at the end of the day.
And it also, again, it ties back also into what I was saying before, with when you have that shift with the netting interval and the credit rates, the best way you can take advantage of that is with a storage system where you can store all the energy you're making your day and then sell it during on-peak period when you get home. And so states and utilities as a whole are kind of taking this more holistic view of looking at distributed generation. Because before it was just like, we need to get solar out on there. But now that as everything is becoming more complex and you're getting more and more of these types of resources, they need to look at it from a system-wide perspective. And that system-wide perspective does include storage and the ability to time your dispatches of this energy.
Very good. Well, Rebecca, thanks for downloading your brain into the buzz today. This was very helpful catch up on the state of play right now and some things to be looking out going forward. Obviously, we'll be looking for the next report, 50 States of Solar. And
we're going to start working on that next week.
Yeah. So when does that publish, and just what else should we be looking out for from DSIRE, the whole team?
So for DSIRE specifically, we have regular updates on all the incentive programs we have for our reports. So the Q2 ends in just a few days. So once that's over, we can actually start reviewing everything, compile our Q2 reports. So those should all be coming out sometime in the month of July, early August. So that'll include our 50 States of Solar report, our grid modernization report, our electric vehicle report, and our power decarbonization report. We also have a couple data sheets coming out. I believe one that outlines state level implementation of PURPA policies. And then we also have a data sheet that outlines every single investor owned utility's avoided cost rate. So those should be coming out in a couple of weeks as well that you can purchase.
Awesome. Well, there's a million things happening, so I know you guys are going to stay busy over there. But thanks for taking some time to stop by and chat with me today.
Yeah, glad to be of service. Good to be here.